How mitakuyepi. Hello everyone. Recently I've come across a discussion in which a Lakota elder stated that Lakota language was never written and this is why the language is dying. That this is why nobody wants to learn the Lakota language, that there really is not a big interest in it among Lakota people. And the argument is not even half true. Parts of it are true, but there's a lot of background missing from this discussion. First of all, in April 10th, 1883, there was a law that said that all Indian languages in America are then considered illegal, that no one is allowed to speak their Indian language. No Indian is allowed to speak his or her Indian language, especially in public, and you could go to jail for that. And the ceremonies were also outlawed too. They were then considered illegal too on that same day. And this is during the early days of the reservations, when the reservations were prison camps. And people were not allowed to leave off the reservation. They were not allowed to go off the reservation. They could only travel within the reservation. You had to get special permission from the Indian agent to visit a relative on another reservation, like, for example, a funeral or something like that. An Indian agent is an American white guy, and he is in control of the legal proceedings of the reservation. So he's like the boss back then. So since 1883, it was against the law to speak any Indian language. And then comes another experience called the boarding school experience. The boarding schools were created by a non-native group called Friends of the Indians. They were based on the East Coast. These were wealthy white Americans that wanted to help Indian people. And they discussed amongst themselves, how can we civilize these Indian people? And they came up with the idea that the best way to do it is to take the youngest ones off the reservation and educate them in a Western school system, American schools, to civilize them and to take them far away from their homeland so they don't have any kind of cultural reinforcement. This would make it easier to brainwash them. And this evolved into a government plan, and the result was the creation of these boarding schools, these huge boarding schools in different parts of America, where children were forcefully removed from their families and sent there to be civilized. One of the biggest schools was in Pennsylvania. It was called the Carlisle Indian Industrial School. It was like a military. They all had uniforms. In the mornings, the guys had to tend to the housekeeping, cleaning the school. There were animals there, so they had to take care of them. And the girls, they would spend the mornings cooking and washing clothes and things like that. And then they would have lunch, and then after that, they had their school lessons. Very strict. And the boys, they had little military uniforms, and they were marched around, and it was horrible. And when these children first arrived at the boarding schools, they were put in line, and they had kerosene poured on top of their hair to kill all the bugs, and then they cut all the hair off. And in many native traditions, native people only cut their hair when somebody close to them had died. So this was a very traumatic experience for these children as they're standing in line and they're watching the ones in front of them all get their hair cut off. The girls also had their hair cut really short. And then their schooling began, and if they said any Indian word, they were severely tortured as punishment. If they even talked about their homeland, they were tortured for that too. They were humiliated. All kinds of abuse went on at these schools, sexual abuse especially. And a lot of children were killed because this physical abuse was horrendous. They did not do background checks for the teachers or the workers who came to work there. So a lot of perverts got jobs there. A lot of sadomasochistic people got jobs there. And for them, it was like they could pick who and what they wanted and any time they wanted and do their bad things to them. And because of that, a lot of children were killed. Some committed suicide. Some died of loneliness. They died of heartbreak because they were told that all their family had been killed by whatever disease and that there was nobody there. It was a very trying time. Those who made it through these schools were very traumatized. They had post-traumatic stress disorder. But they tried their best to survive. Many of them became Christians because, hey, you're tortured if you speak your language or even talk about your culture, and it does something to you. Then they're also eating foods that are not healthy for them. And this is affecting their mind. It's affecting their thought processes. They're forced to go to church, and all they hear is Christianity or Catholicism. And by the time they get out of the school, they just want to be safe. So a lot of them fell in line and they became Christians. Not all of them, but many of them did. Christianization was happening on the reservations too. The adults who were there, they were also going through a similar process. The medicine people and the holy people were taken away to a mental institution in Canton, South Dakota, and they were left there to die. So the Indian peoples had no spiritual guidance, and they started going to church. They're also not eating healthy food either because, as I said, it's illegal to leave the reservation. And they can't hunt, can't do anything really. So they are given food by the American government, and this food is really unhealthy. And the result of that was heart disease and diabetes and other diseases. So now their bodies are not receiving the nutrition that it needs. They can't leave the reservation. They cannot speak their language. They cannot do their ceremonies, so they're hit physically, spiritually, and emotionally. And this made their minds weak. And as they went to church for spiritual guidance, they started to believe what these priests were saying. They were being brainwashed. So it's happening on the reservations, and it was happening in the boarding schools as well. So things were looking pretty bad. Now, for Lakota people, we are not matriarchal, and we are not patriarchal either. We are something different. But as we became Christian, we became patriarchal. And this starts to affect Lakota society in a very unhealthy way. And people were very staunch Christians and Catholics, and they didn't want to speak the language because they got tortured for it. So they didn't teach it to their children. Those who made it through the boarding schools, when they grew up, they married each other. They didn't teach it to their children either because they did not want their children to experience those same punishments that they had to endure. Then you look at the situation several generations later, and now we are at a point where most Indian people cannot speak their own language, and many of them do not even have a desire to learn it. This is why the language is dying. So in the discussion that I mentioned earlier at the beginning, this person forgot to mention what I just told you. This Lakota elder forgot to say that, yeah, it was against the law in 1883, and it was not until 1978, which is almost 100 years later, that America made a law called the American Indian Religious Freedom Act of 1978 that stated it was now okay to speak your Indian language in public and to do your ceremonies too. It's crazy. But that's American history. This elder, this Lakota elder that made this statement that I reiterated at the beginning of this video, this elder forgot to mention that too. This elder forgot to mention this law, the American Indian Religious Freedom Act of 1978. This elder forgot to talk about that. That's the reason why Indian languages are dying. And because of the reasons I stated, a lot of young Indian people will say, well, why do we have to learn it? Because nobody speaks it. If you go on to almost any reservation in the United States, most of the reservations speak English. It's really sad. The brainwashing was very successful. Okay, so in Lakota country, sometime in the 1960s or so, or maybe even earlier than that, there were two linguists from the University of Colorado in Boulder. They came to Lakota country and visited with Lakota elders, and they identified themselves as who they are, and they wanted to do a study of the Lakota language. And they were able to get information, and they developed an orthography. They developed a way to write the language. They created some materials to use, but unfortunately, it was against the law to speak Lakota back then. So there wasn't much they could do with that. And there were other linguists who had come to Lakota country as well and developed other methods of writing the language and so forth. But even before that, there was a Christian or Catholic priest by the name of Stephen R. Riggs, who lived among the Dakota people in eastern South Dakota, Minnesota area. Not exactly sure where he was situated, but he developed a lot of things into the Dakota dialect, the Dakota language. The main difference between Lakota and Dakota is that where we have L's, the Dakota people will use a D instead. It's the main difference, but other than that, it's the same language. We have the same spirituality, same culture, just a little bit different dialect. But we're basically the same people. But the Stephen R. Riggs, to get them in church, he started to do things in Dakota. He developed a dictionary, a prayer book, a hymn book. He's a Catholic, yeah, but he did make really good efforts at preserving the Dakota language. On Pine Ridge, there was another one by the name of Buckel. And I think he was stationed in Rosebud and then Pine Ridge or something like that. But he recorded a lot of cool things too. He wanted people to be Catholic to get them in church. He started to do things in Lakota. But even though these priests were part of the Christianization brainwashing, still they helped to save the language by writing it, recording it, but beginning in 1978, it was okay, like I said, because of this American Indian Religious Freedom Act that said it's now okay for Indians to speak their languages and do their ceremonies. Since that time, we could also openly write our language. Now, we were writing our language before that. Don't get me wrong, okay? People were still speaking their language. They just did it in private or at home or at their own festivities. As the time became like in the 1950s and 60s, it was brought out more into the public. Even though it was against the law, they still brought it out more in the public than in the early 1900s. In the early 1900s, you could go to jail for speaking your Indian language. But by the time of the 1950s, maybe the 40s too, people were doing it anyway. They were speaking it anyway in public. And there were some small cases where Indian schools would still have a Lakota language course anyway. Nobody tried to stop them by that time. So there were places where you could learn the language before 1978. Then people were learning to write it. The problem was all these linguists had different orthographies. They had different ways of writing the language, which is still a matter of confusion today. However, in the early 1980s, there was a group of elders from the 5 Lakota-speaking reservations that would meet in different towns or different places. And these reservations are the Lower Brule Sioux Reservation, the Rosebud Sioux Reservation, the Pine Ridge Sioux Reservation, Cheyenne River Sioux Reservation, and Standing Rock Sioux Reservation. On the very north side of Standing Rock, there are Dakota people living up there, like in the community of Cannonball, North Dakota, and thereabouts. Those people are Dakota, and they speak the D dialect, the Dakota dialect. But the rest of Standing Rock is Lakota. They are Hunkpapcha Lakota. These are Sitting Bull's people. So there were meetings of Lakota elders from those 5 reservations, and their sole purpose was, how are we going to write our language? Up until that time, like I said, there were orthographies or ways of writing the language, but they were all developed by white people. And so the Lakota elders wanted a system that could be shared by all Lakota people that they come up with themselves. See, these linguists, they could have said, how can we help you save your language? But they didn't do that. They just came and studied and made their materials, and that's it. Nobody asked the Indians, how can we help you? Give us some ideas. We would like to help you. Nobody did that. So the Lakota elders decided to take this task upon themselves. So they would meet for several days and they would discuss among themselves. How do you guys say this? And how do we write this? Their first task was identifying how many sounds are there in the Lakota language. Because these non-native linguists, one would say, yeah, there's 27 sounds in Lakota. Another one would say, no, there's 31 or 32. And another one would say, no, there is 1,527 sounds. Hey, not that many. No, but the point I'm making is none of them agreed with each other. These linguists who came to study the Lakota language, none of them agreed with each other, and they all created different symbols to denote sounds like the sh and the r, things like that. Those are some of the sounds in Lakota language, and each one of these linguists had their own way to write that sound. So this is why these Lakota elders met. They thought, if anybody's going to develop a system of writing the Lakota language, it's best if it comes from the Lakota people themselves. So these elders first decided we need to find out how many sounds we have. And after several days, they realized we have 40 sounds. So the next thing was, how are we going to write those sounds? So they would talk about it. They would put up what these non-native linguists would write, and they would say, no, we don't like that because it's confusing, and so forth. And so they came up with a new way of writing the language. Even before that, they were thinking, shall we use the alphabet of the English language, which is A, B, C, D, like that. But of course you have your radicals who say, well, that's the white man's alphabet. But that's not true. This alphabet is the result of a long evolution. It begins with the Egyptian hieroglyphs. Egyptians are not white people. Then it evolves further until a group of people called the Phoenicians developed a system based on the Egyptian hieroglyphs, and the Phoenicians are not white people either. And then it evolves several more times. It evolves to an Arabic system of letters, and then that continues to evolve some more into a Greek style, and then it evolves to a Latin alphabet. And then it continues to evolve to the English language. So, in most of that evolution time of this system of writing, the systems were created by people who were not white. It's just when it gets to the English level that's when they start using it like that. So, people think that it's a white man's alphabet, but it's really not. So I want to point that out. Do your research. You'll find the same information. That's what I did. So, once these Lakota elders realized this is not a white man's alphabet, they decided to use it because that's what everybody is used to. When they're reading English or whatever, they're used to seeing A, B, C, D. So this is why they decided to stay with that alphabet, because they want to make it as less stressful as possible to maintain, retain this language, to save this language. So they said, okay, we'll use the ABCD letters, but there are some sounds that are going to be a little bit difficult in writing. So they needed to add some symbols on there. Like I said, one of the sounds is a sh sound. How do we write that? They don't want to write SH because it might be confusing when it comes into combination with other words. So they decided to create symbols. This is called the orthography, as I said earlier. And then they were finishing up their meetings and they never got a chance to name this orthography. But they developed it, yeah? These Lakota elders developed this orthography. And then the meeting stopped because to do these meetings, it was the various Sioux tribes that were funding it. And they decided not to fund it anymore. It's because of money. Yeah. So a lot of the Sioux tribes were like, oh, we don't want to fund this. This costs too much. Didn't even care about our language. Yeah. All they saw it was in terms of money. So the tribe stopped funding these meetings and the meeting stopped. Then we have a well-known Lakota language teacher who is also my mentor by the name of Albert Waihat Sr. He's a Sicangu Lakota from the Rosebud Sioux tribe. He got hired as a Lakota language teacher on his reservation, and he wanted to look for materials to use, and there are some that the Rosebud Sioux tribe has developed over the years, but a lot of that was funded under the Catholic Church, and there were things in there that he didn't entirely agree with. So he thought, well, these Lakota elders, they were meeting. They met on Rosebud. And he wanted to know what happened to those meetings. And he found the notes of those meetings. And then in those notes, he found that orthography. And he thought, this is cool. Because this was created by Lakota elders themselves. So he decided, this is what I'm going to use. And then, after years go by, a book is made by him. It's designed for university 16-week semester program. But the information is really good, and there's cultural information in there too. And he uses that orthography, that system of writing that was developed by all these Lakota elders from the 5 different Lakota reservations that I spoke about earlier. He never gave it a name, he just used it. So because of that, people mistakenly call that orthography the Albert Whitehat orthography. But he would say that it's not his. He would say, that's not mine. I don't know why people call it that. It's not mine. As I said, it was a group of Lakota elders that developed this. He gives them credit. But other people don't know the story, so they say, oh, the Albert Whitehat orthography. It's really not. And when I became a Lakota language teacher, I decided to use that too, but then I grew up on Cheyenne River. My father's from Rosebud, but I grew up on Cheyenne River, and I taught on the Cheyenne River Sioux tribe. So I wanted to show respect to my relatives on Rosebud, and I wanted to use materials that are Cheyenne River. Because see, the Lakota language is the same on all Lakota-speaking reservations. But there are some things that are said differently. For example, on Pine Ridge and Rosebud, when they meet each other and they say, how are you? They say, tunik tukahe or tunik tukaho, depending on the situation and whether you're a man or a woman. Men normally would say, tunik tukaho in formal situations. But when they're meeting somebody in an informal way and they want to extend friendship, then they're going to speak like they're in a tioshpaye, which is an extended family. And they will then say, tonik tukahe. When you hear a man says, tonik tukahe, he's extending friendship to you. This is what you don't hear in books. Instead, today you hear, all men must say ho, and all women must say he at the end of their questions. Sounds Catholic. That's Catholic influenced. That's not the reality. Men will say he in informal situations or when extending fellowship to other people. They will say he at the end of their question. See, in Lakota thinking, there's always going to be an exception to the rules. In Catholic and Christian thinking, it can only be this way and this way only. That's called dogma. That's not the Lakota way of thinking. So, for those of you who are learning Lakota language or you want to learn the Lakota language, if you ever run into something where it says men must say this and only this, that's not the Lakota way of thinking. And I would not recommend those materials that speak like that. See, on Cheyenne River, we don't say toniktuka. We say dokeshke. And in Rosebud, they say toshke. See the differences? It means the same thing, but it's like a passport. It's like a vocal passport. When somebody comes to me and says toshke yaunhe, then I know he's from Rosebud. If he says toniktukahe, then I know he's either from a certain part of Rosebud or Pine Ridge. If I say to that person, dokeshkeya unhe, I'm extending fellowship because I'm using the word he. And that person knows I'm from Cheyenne River because we say dokeshke. So it's little things like that. But most words are the same on all reservations. So there were no books that taught the Cheyenne River flavor, you could say. So I developed lessons for my students. And my mother, her first language is Lakota, so I would always have her approve everything. And she would add the female element in the lessons too, so this way I could teach my female students in an effective way. So, when I developed my own materials, I looked at the same orthography that Albert Whitehat uses, and I found that there were two things that could be confusing. The sh sound is a S with a dot over it. However, when you say the Lakota guttural sounds, they also have a dot. For example, the K guttural, it's written with the K and the dot. When you say this sound, it sounds like this. You hear that? It's a rough sound. When you say the S with a dot, it sounds like this. Shh. And you hear? That's a soft sound. It's not rough. It doesn't have that sound. So I thought the dot shouldn't be used for that S with the dot, that sh sound. So I used a circle, a small circle on top of the S to give the sh sound. So I just developed a little bit further for my students because I wanted them to have it as easy as possible to learn this language, because learning Lakota is kind of difficult. It's only at the beginning though. We have something that's really big in our language, is something called conjugations. And we have 3 systems of doing that. And once you learn those systems really good, learning Lakota becomes really easy after that. I'll guarantee you that, because I have students who have gone through that. The students that I teach personally will tell you the same thing. So Albert's book came out like in 1990 something, the late 90s. But there were other books too. The Oglala Lakota College had a Lakota language course as well that came with cassettes back in those days, 15 cassettes. But what I'm saying is, there were courses that existed back in the 1980s. There were Lakota language courses that existed. People were writing in Lakota. That is the truth. You can find this stuff. Look at the copyrights. You'll see 1977, 1981. People were already trying to save the language. So when this Lakota elder stated that the Lakota language was never written before, that person was wrong. Yes, it has been written. And this elder was saying that our language is dying, but this elder never explained why. Why is the language dying? This elder never said anything about the fact that our language was once illegal, it was against the law, until 1978. This elder didn't even mention that law. This is the reason why I'm making this video, because I want you to know the facts. I want you to know the history. I want you to know the reason why our language is barely surviving. And I adopt the stance that my mentor had, in that he went to the elders and looked for what they had to say. And he found these papers from these meetings that these elders had from the 5 different reservations. And that's what fired him up. And that's the same thing that I used as well. We went to the source. The source is Lakota. It's not in a university that has non-native linguists analyzing our language. That's not the source. The language belongs to the culture, and that's how I teach. I teach so that you start talking right away. A lot of people will say, okay, today we're going to learn the colors, and then tomorrow we'll learn the numbers. Well, that's fine and dandy. But that's not talking. The reason why we have language is so we can communicate to each other. How are you doing? How are you feeling? What's your name? Shall we go eat? Let's dance. Let's sing. Yeah? Our language is designed to communicate. So learning lists of words is not enough. So the way I teach is getting you to dialogue right away and helping you say things that you say every day so that you can incorporate that. That's how you learn a language, by learning what you're going to say, not by saying, this pencil is yellow. How many times are you going to say that? I want you to learn things like Lila Tayan Wa Chiang, it's really nice to see you. Napcheni Tchawa O Chius Ba Wa Chin, I want to hold your hand. Those are cool things. That's what language is about, communicating so that we come close to each other, that we bind to each other, that we connect to each other. This is what Lakota means. Lakota means allies. When you speak Lakota, you do it in the way that the words embrace the person you're talking to. Or even if you don't get along, at least you speak in a way that shows respect to the other. You don't have to always agree with each other. You can agree to disagree and still have peace. That's how Lakota language is too. So even if you don't get along with somebody, you still can speak to each other in a respectful, civil way without hurting one another. This is why there's no swear words or there's no cuss words in Lakota. There's no bad words in Lakota. It doesn't mean it's all good. It means it's about communicating in a clear and effective way so that nobody misunderstands each other, because we respect one another. We honor one another, even if we don't agree with each other. To love one another. Tekichi Chilapo. So I just would like you to think about this. Let these thoughts dwell upon you. Check out the history. Like I said, I encourage you to Google it. Boarding schools, reservations, the American Indian Religious Freedom Act of 1978. Google that. Knowledge. It's good to have knowledge. Knowledge and wisdom. These are very good things to have. It really helps you to live freely when you can learn so that you can live, so that you can love. And I say this in honor and respect to the Lakota elders from the 5 Lakota-speaking reservations who were at these meetings and came up with these ideas, in which one of them evolved into this orthography that I spoke to you about. Hoheche duelo mitakuyepi. That's the way it is, everybody. Thank you very much for taking the time to listen to this video. I really, really appreciate it. And if you would like to send a special thanks in support of this channel, look at the bottom of this video where the title is, and right under that, where it says like, dislike, and share, right in that area, slide it towards the left, and you will see the symbols change, and then you will see a heart-shaped button that says thanks on it. If you would like to click on there to send your thanks of support, I would really appreciate it, as I really do enjoy making these videos and speaking with you and spending some time with you. And all I ask is that you take the time to think about the message and come up with your own ideas. So again, thank you very much for listening. To learn more about Lakota spirituality, I have written a book called Wichocha Otechike. This book also includes Lakota Star Knowledge information. All the videos that I make, which are about Lakota spirituality, Lakota Star Knowledge, and cultural information, are based on this book. This book costs 99 American dollars. This price includes the shipping cost as well as a tracking number. And to learn more about Lakota language, I have written a Lakota language book called Chante Etanha Owoglake, Speaking from the Heart. And all my Lakota language videos are based on this book. This book costs 119 American dollars. This price includes the shipping cost as well as a tracking number. I also teach online and I give spiritual consultations as well. If you are interested in any of my services and products, you can send payment via PayPal to my email address, which is hehaka7@yahoo.com. That's HEHAKA, the number 7, @yahoo.com. When you send your payment, please include your shipping address and your email address. Lila Pilamaelo, thank you very much. And I will catch you in the next video. In the Lakota way, everything is circular. As a result, we do not have a word for goodbye in the Lakota language. And so instead we say until next time, which in Lakota is Doksha Ake.